Imagine this. You've spent decades working yourself to the bone, extra shifts, aching hands, late nights, just so your son could have a better life. You even paid down his mortgage in secret, keeping his family afloat when money was tight. And then on Christmas week, you call, hoping for nothing more than a chair at the table, a chance to see your grandchildren open their gifts. What you hear instead is, "We weren't expecting you, Dad." What would you do if those words came from your own child? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss how this story unfolds. Because sometimes the deepest cuts don't come from strangers, they come from the ones you love most. The story. I had already set the table. Just one plate, one fork, one knife, lined up neatly like soldiers on a quiet battlefield. It was Christmas Eve, though my house didn't quite remember what that meant anymore. The tree still stood in the corner, a little smaller each year, its ornaments heavy with memories that only I seemed to carry. The lights glowed with a stubborn cheer, but the room felt too big for just one man. I had told myself I wouldn't hope, but hope is a stubborn tenant. It sneaks in through the draft under the door, through the smell of cinnamon in the kitchen, through the memory of laughter that once filled these walls. So, after pacing the kitchen twice, I finally pressed call. My son picked up quickly. His voice carried the noise of another house, a full house. I could hear children laughing, the clink of glass on glass, the rustle of wrapping paper. It painted a picture without my name on it. "Hey, Dad," he said, casual, distracted. "Hey there, son." I smiled into the phone, though no one could see it. "Got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" I hesitated, then let the words out carefully. "The way you set down something fragile. I was thinking about coming by tonight. I could bring over your mom's rolls. You know, the one she always burned just a little, but we ate anyway. I still have her recipe card." For a moment there was only the sound of voices in the background. Then, like a door clicking shut, he said, "We weren't expecting you, Dad." I froze, not because the words were cruel. They weren't. He said them the way you'd read off a weather report. Calm, inevitable. But they landed heavy, and I felt them settle in the quiet part of me that still thought a father always had a place at his child's table. "Oh," I said, my voice lighter than I felt. "I thought. It's just, we've got the in-laws this year. The kid's schedule's nuts. Honestly, Dad, it's easier if we keep it small." Small, that was the word, small like the space left for me. He added quickly, like a man tossing a bandage on a wound, "But hey, we'll FaceTime tomorrow. The kids can open one present with you on camera. It'll be fun." "Sounds nice," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if he heard me. In the background, I heard his wife call his name, cheerful and commanding. Paper rustled. Someone laughed. He covered the phone with his hand as if even his father wasn't supposed to hear the sound of his family. "Dad, I gotta go," he said. "We're decorating gingerbread." "Of course," I replied. "You do that, I'll be here." "Love you," he added quickly, softly. "Love you too." And then the line went dead. I didn't put the phone down right away. I held it to my ear, hoping the silence might change its mind. It didn't. The tree twinkled faintly across the room. The ornaments looked back at me like old friends who'd come anyway, even without an invitation. There was the popsicle stick star my son had glued together in first grade. The ceramic snowman Ellen loved, with its chipped nose but still smiling face. A tiny frame holding his school picture the year his teeth grew in crooked and perfect. I sat in Ellen's chair, still hers, even years later. The cushion sagged in the shape her body had left behind, and for a moment it felt like she was still there, humming as she wrapped gifts with too much tape, shaking her head when the tree leaned left again. "We weren't expecting you, Dad." The words echoed in the quiet. I thought about all the Christmases past, the nights I worked double shifts just to afford gifts, the mornings when I pretended I wasn't tired so he could open presents and see his father smiling. I remember driving through a snowstorm one year, chasing down the last bicycle in the county because he had asked Santa, and I didn't want him to know how thin money had been that winter. I remembered the year Ellen stitched curtains for the dollhouse I built in the garage, staying up late to make it perfect, and how our son squealed when he saw it. "Daddy, it looks just like our house." Back then I was expected, needed, even adored. Now I was an inconvenience, a burden, a footnote in my own family's holiday. I walked into the kitchen. The cinnamon water had boiled down to nothing, leaving the air faintly sweet and bitter. I turned off the burner. On the counter, a pie rack waited without a pie. The blue and white china still sat on the table, one plate set with its fork and knife. I put them back into the cabinet. A man gets used to silence after a while, but holiday silence is different. It's not just absence, it's presence denied. I poured myself soup from a can, stirred it with the same spoon I once used for gravy that took all day. I carried the bowl to the table, folded my hands, and said a wordless prayer, the kind that doesn't ask for miracles, only for dignity. The steam fogged my glasses. I took them off and let the room blur until it was kinder. Later, when I checked my phone, there was a text from my son. "Don't forget we'll FaceTime around 6. The kids get cranky after." Attached was a photo. My grandchildren, cheeks red, eyes bright, icing on their lips. Behind them, a gingerbread house leaned at a brave angle. Stockings lined the mantel in careful cursive. I typed back, "Can't wait. Tell them Grandpa loves their architecture." A joke, thin wrapping on an empty box. People like to say Christmas brings out the best in us. I've learned it brings out the truth, not always loudly. Sometimes softly, like snow collecting on a branch until it bends and breaks under the weight. Tonight my truth was simple. I was not expected. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that one day soon, my son would learn what happens when a father who has given everything finally decides he has nothing left to lose. The soup grew cold before I finished it. Not because I'd left it sitting there, but because I'd eaten too slowly, spoonful after spoonful, as though each swallow was a task that demanded patience. I wasn't really hungry anyway. Hunger is about the body. Loneliness eats at something deeper. I rinsed the bowl, set it in the rack, and wiped down the counter. The motions were automatic, the kind Ellen used to scold me for doing with too much force. "Roy, the dishes aren't going to run away," she'd laugh, pressing her hand against mine to slow me down. But she wasn't here to stop me now. And the silence after her laughter had become so long, so steady, that sometimes I forgot what my own house used to sound like. I wandered into the living room and stood in front of the tree. The lights glowed softly against the window. Outside, flakes of snow began to fall, small, hesitant at first, as if even the sky wasn't sure if it wanted to commit to this holiday. I sank into Ellen's chair. It fit me poorly, too small in the hips, too soft in the cushion, but I kept it exactly as it was. The indent from her body was still there, shaped by years of evenings when she sat with a book, one ankle tucked beneath the other. Sometimes, when the lights were off, I swore I could still smell the faint trace of her lavender lotion on the fabric. My eyes fell to the photograph on the mantel. Ellen's face smiled back, frozen forever in the red sweater she'd loved. It was taken at Christmas years ago, the year she insisted on hosting the entire neighborhood. She'd stayed up all night preparing pies, complaining the whole time, and then had beamed like a schoolgirl when everyone complimented her cooking. That was Ellen. She lived for the moment she could give more than she had. I had thought I'd done the same for our son. I closed my eyes and let the memories wash in, uninvited but relentless. I saw myself in the workshop behind the garage, late at night, fingers raw with splinters as I sanded the wood for the dollhouse. Ellen had sewn the tiny curtains. Caitlin, no, that was my neighbor's girl. My own boy, Michael, had been 7 at the time. His eyes had gone wide when he saw the dollhouse for his cousin, and though he pretended he didn't care, I caught him peeking at it for weeks. On Christmas morning, I'd given him the bicycle instead. Red, with shiny handlebars and a bow tied sloppy but sincere. He'd hugged me so tightly then. "You're the best, Dad," he'd said, words a father saves in the deepest part of his chest. Another memory, the year we almost lost the house. The mortgage payments had piled up after Ellen's surgery. I'd worked double shifts, cut every corner, even pawned the watch my father left me. But I hadn't let the house go, because that house wasn't just walls. It was the cradle of every Christmas morning, every birthday, every night Ellen hummed Michael to sleep. Later, when Michael married, I quietly co-signed his first mortgage. He never knew how close he was to losing it. I made payments when he couldn't, slipped money into his account, told him it was just a little help. He believed he'd pulled himself through. I never corrected him. That's what fathers do. We let our children think their strength was theirs alone. And now my strength had become a burden. The clock ticked past 9. The neighborhood outside was alive with light. Through the curtains, I could see the glow of houses decorated with icicle bulbs, inflatable Santas waving in the wind, laughter spilling out of front doors. Families together. My phone buzzed again. A photo this time, my son with his children, his wife beside him holding a tray of gingerbread cookies. The caption read, "Merry Christmas Eve." I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. It wasn't cruelty. Not exactly. To them it was simply practical, easier, simpler. And yet, the ache of exclusion cut deeper than malice ever could. I set the phone face down on the table. For a long time I just sat there in the dim light, Ellen's photograph watching me like a silent witness. I imagined what she would say if she were still here. She would have frowned, that crease appearing between her brows, the one that deepened when she thought something was unjust. Then she would have said, "Roy, don't let them forget who you are. Don't let them think you're less than the man who built this family with his hands." But I'd let them forget. The night stretched on. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking with the weight of years. At the top, I paused at Michael's old room. The door was still painted blue, his favorite color as a teenager. Inside, the walls were bare now, but I could still see the outlines where posters once hung. Baseball players, rock bands. Things that felt larger than life to a boy who hadn't yet learned how small the world could make you feel. I remembered sitting at that little desk with him, bent over math homework. He'd been frustrated, erasing holes in the paper. I'd guided his hand, shown him the patience numbers required. He'd groaned and told me I didn't understand, but he passed that class. And years later he told me I had been right. Fathers remember these things. Sons rarely do. I closed the door gently and walked to my own room. Ellen's side of the bed was untouched. Her glasses still rested on the nightstand, her bookmark still caught halfway through a novel she never finished. I lay down on my side, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come, only the quiet roar of thoughts too loud to ignore. By midnight I rose again. The house felt heavy, pressing down on me with its silence. I went back downstairs and stood by the window. Snow had fallen properly now, blanketing the street in white. It was beautiful, in that cruel way beauty often is when there's no one beside you to share it. And in that stillness, the ache inside me hardened into something else. Resolve. If my son could say, "We weren't expecting you," as though I were a guest who no longer belonged, then maybe it was time to remind him, remind all of them, that I was not a man to be erased. I turned to the mantel and picked up Ellen's photograph. "Don't worry, love," I whispered. "They'll remember. They will." And as I stood there, the snow falling outside and the Christmas tree glowing faintly behind me, I knew that the heartbreak of this night was only the beginning. Morning light spilled through the curtains, soft and pale, the way it does on winter days when the sun doesn't quite trust itself to shine. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee cooling between my hands. It was too bitter, brewed too long, but I sipped it anyway. Ellen used to tease me that I drank coffee like it was medicine, not comfort. Maybe she was right. The house was still, but my mind was anything but. My son's words from the night before echoed. "We weren't expecting you, Dad." They hadn't just pushed me out of Christmas. They had nudged me out of the family circle altogether. I thought back, as men my age often do, not because the past is easier, but because it makes more sense than the present. I remembered the nights at the construction site, working under floodlights long after most men had gone home. My breath had come out in clouds against the cold, my hands blistered and raw. I'd stayed because there was overtime pay and every dollar mattered. Ellen would pack a thermos of soup, slipping a note in my lunch bag. "One day this will all be worth it." And it was, or so I believed. The overtime checks weren't for vacations or luxuries. They were for tuition, for braces, for all the things our son needed to stand straighter in the world than we had. I remembered the university bills most of all. Stacks of envelopes stamped with numbers that seemed impossible. I'd sit at this very table, papers spread out, pen in hand, trying to make the math work. Ellen would rub the back of my neck, whispering, "Roy, you can't keep this up forever." But I did. For 4 years I worked double shifts. Concrete dust in my lungs, plaster under my fingernails, calluses so thick I barely felt the pen in my hand as I signed the checks. $48,000. That's what a degree had cost us then, and I'd paid every cent, proud each time I wrote "paid in full." When Michael crossed the stage in his cap and gown, he waved into the crowd, his smile wide and bright. He didn't see me, not at first, but I saw him. And in that moment I thought, this is what fathers are for. The sacrifices didn't end with college. When he got married, I told him we could afford maybe $5,000 for the wedding. He had nodded, grateful. But then his fiancée had wept, real tears, shimmering with dreams of a perfect day. Michael looked at me helplessly, torn between love and reality, and I had caved. $32,000. That's what it ended up costing. I worked weekends for 6 months, installing hardwood floors for a contractor who paid under the table. My back ached, my knees burned, but on the day of the wedding, when my son whispered, "You're the best father in the world," as we danced, I told myself it was worth it. He promised he'd never forget, and for a while maybe he didn't. I thought, too, of the house. The one he lived in now, with its manicured lawn and 2-car garage, as though such things had grown naturally from the soil. He never knew how close he'd come to losing it. Jeremy, his wife, had lost her job that year. The bills had piled up. The bank had started calling. Michael had been ashamed, too proud to tell anyone, but fathers know. We hear worry in the pause before our children say, "I'm fine." So I stepped in, quietly, signed the papers, co-signed the mortgage, covered the payments when he couldn't. He believed they had managed. I let him believe that. It's a strange kind of love, making your children think they were stronger than they were, hiding your own exhaustion so they could sleep easier at night. I still remember the day I mailed the first check. I sat in my truck in the bank's parking lot, staring at the amount. It was more than I'd ever held in my hands at once. I thought of Ellen. "Don't give him so much he forgets to be grateful." Her words had been half a warning, half a prayer, and now here I was, decades later, wondering if I had done exactly that. I pushed the coffee aside and leaned back in the chair. The kitchen felt smaller than it once had. The walls seemed to lean in, heavy with secrets I'd never spoken aloud. Sacrifice is a peculiar thing. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't get parades or thank you speeches. It's quiet, invisible. The world only sees the results, the diploma, the wedding photos, the family home. The cost disappears into the calluses of a father's hands, into the wrinkles that line his face, into the nights he falls asleep too tired to dream. Michael never asked how it all added up. Maybe that was my mistake. I made it too easy for him not to ask. I stood and wandered into the living room. The tree still glowed in the corner. On the mantel sat more reminders, framed photos of Christmas mornings long gone. One showed Michael at 5 years old, his hair sticking up like a halo, tearing into wrapping paper with a grin that split his face in two. Ellen had taken the picture. I had been in the background, smiling with the kind of pride that can't be faked. Another photo showed him at 12, holding a baseball bat. I'd coached his little league team that year, though I'd barely known the rules. Every Saturday morning I'd driven the kids to games, yelling encouragement even when I didn't understand the plays. Michael had struck out more times than I could count, but he'd kept trying and I'd kept cheering, louder than anyone. Because that's what fathers do, cheer louder even when no one else does. The day stretched on. Snow piled against the windows, muffling the world. I found myself drifting back to the mantel, staring at Ellen's photograph again. I thought I was doing the right thing. I whispered to her smile. Every sacrifice was for him, for us, but maybe I made it too easy. Maybe I let him forget the cost. Her eyes, frozen in that eternal red sweater, seemed to say what she had once told me in life. "Roy, you're too generous for your own good." I pressed my hand against the frame, the glass cool beneath my palm. That's when something inside me began to harden. If Michael had forgotten the sacrifices, then maybe it was time he remembered. Not through words, he wouldn't listen to those anymore, but through the kind of lesson life rarely lets a man forget. I lowered the photo back onto the mantel, straightened my shoulders, and sat down at the table with a pad of paper. I began listing, line by line, every check, every overtime shift, every silent gift he had never seen. The numbers added up in black ink, harsh and undeniable. By the time I set the pen down, one truth had crystallized. I had built his life with my hands. And if he thought I was nothing more than a burden, then perhaps it was time to show him just how wrong he was. While I sat with pen and paper, tracing the years of sacrifice into black ink, my son's house across town pulsed with another rhythm entirely. I can imagine it even now because I know him. I know the warmth of his living room when the fireplace roars, the glow of the Christmas tree reflected in polished hardwood floors, the same hardwood I had once installed with my own 2 hands. I know the sound of children running, their feet drumming like a parade against the boards, their laughter breaking against the walls in joyous echoes. There in that house Christmas was alive. Michael leaned back on the couch, his arms slung across the top cushion, the picture of a man at ease. His wife, Lauren, bustled about in her red sweater dress, carrying trays of gingerbread cookies and eggnog, her laughter spilling freely as she balanced the demands of children and in-laws. Their tree was larger than mine, taller, lusher, dripping with ornaments bought from catalogs instead of crafted by small hands. Gold ribbons wound around the branches like rivers of sunlight. Beneath it, gifts were piled high, their paper gleaming in metallic reds and silvers, bows so intricate they looked like art installations rather than wrappings to be torn apart in a frenzy tomorrow morning. The children, my grandchildren, sat cross-legged on the rug, frosting cookies with sticky fingers, their cheeks bright with sugar and joy. They wore matching pajamas, the kind sold in glossy magazines, red flannel with white snowflakes, soft as clouds. Michael's in-laws clapped along to a Christmas playlist streaming from a smart speaker. Songs filled the house, cheerful carols about family, love, and togetherness. None of them noticed the irony. When Michael's phone buzzed earlier that evening, he had glanced down, seen my name, and hesitated for just a moment. Then he'd answered, his voice friendly, but his eyes already looking past the screen toward the gingerbread assembly line. "Hey, Dad." The conversation was quick, efficient, tucked between cookie trays and holiday chatter. When he hung up, Lauren had returned with a tray of hot chocolate. "Who was that?" she asked. "Dad," Michael replied, already slipping the phone into his pocket, her eyebrows lifted. "Is he coming tomorrow?" He shook his head, almost relieved. "No, he'll do a video call. It's easier that way." She nodded, satisfied, and handed him a mug. Neither of them thought twice about it. The night went on. They ate roast beef and mashed potatoes, gravy poured thick over the plate. Wine glasses clinked as they toasted to a successful year, to promotions and new cars, to vacations booked for the coming summer. My son laughed, loud, carefree, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from him in years. He had always been handsome, but comfort had given him a different sheen, the kind that comes when a man forgets the weight of struggle. He leaned into his wife, kissed her cheek as their children shrieked with glee over a gingerbread roof that collapsed under too much icing. For a moment, he looked like a man who had never known sacrifice. And maybe he hadn't, not really. After dinner, they gathered by the fire. Stockings hung on the mantel, embroidered with names in careful cursive. His children tugged at his arm, begging for just one present, "Please, Daddy." Lauren laughed and shook her head, but Michael, soft-hearted in moments that cost him nothing, agreed. He picked up a box wrapped in silver, handed it to his youngest. The little girl tore into it with squeals of delight. Inside was a dollhouse, glossy and perfect, manufactured to precision. She clapped her hands, hugged her father, her eyes wide with wonder. Michael smiled, proud, basking in her joy. He didn't think of the dollhouse from decades earlier, the one his father had built by hand in a garage, sanding wood until his fingers bled, his wife sewing tiny curtains late into the night. He didn't think of the overtime shifts that had bought the screws, the nails, the paint. He thought only of the present moment, his daughter's laughter, the glow of his family, the warmth of being surrounded by people who expected him, who celebrated him. Later, when the children were finally coaxed into bed, their stockings bulging with hidden treasures, Michael poured himself another glass of wine. His father hadn't come, and though a small flicker of guilt nudged at him, it was quickly extinguished by the fire's glow, the softness of the couch, the comfort of knowing tomorrow would be loud and joyful exactly as he wanted. "FaceTime tomorrow," he reminded Lauren, more out of duty than desire. She nodded. Of course. The kids should at least say hi. And that was it. The thought of his father, his sacrifices, his loneliness was folded neatly away, tucked into the corner of his mind, where inconveniences are stored and forgotten. Meanwhile, across town, I sat in the quiet, staring at the ink on the paper, each line a reminder of what had been given, what had been taken, what had been forgotten. The contrast was unbearable. In one house, warmth, laughter, abundance. In another, silence, memory, and a single man holding on to dignity with trembling hands. It's strange the way families split. Not in arguments or explosions, but in small decisions. A wedding too expensive. A mortgage paid quietly. A Christmas invitation rescinded. You don't notice the distance until the miles have already stretched between you. Michael's house was full, overflowing. Mine was hollow, echoing. But as I sat in Ellen's chair, the pen and paper before me, one thought hardened in my chest. He may have forgotten, but I had not. And soon, very soon, he would remember everything. The night settled heavy around me, pressing its weight against the windows like a reminder. Outside, snow fell steady, blanketing the street in silence. The kind of silence that amplifies everything inside your head. I walked through the house with no purpose, only to fill the emptiness. Each room carried its own ghost. In the dining room, the long table sat bare. Years ago, it had been crowded, plates clattering, chairs scraping, voices overlapping in laughter and argument. Ellen at one end, me at the other, Michael between us, leaning across to steal another helping of mashed potatoes. Tonight, the table was nothing but polished wood and a single candle stub left from last year. I paused, letting my hand drag across its surface. My reflection looked back at me in the sheen, older, lined eyes that seemed to sink deeper every season. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon, though the pot had been washed and the counters wiped down. I opened the cupboard and stared at the cans stacked neatly: soup, beans, tuna. Functional food, food for one. Once I had stocked these shelves with boxes of cereal for Michael. With hot chocolate packets he would drink 2 at a time, with peanut butter that seemed to vanish overnight because he'd sneak spoonfuls straight from the jar. I smiled faintly at the memory, but it died quickly. The shelves now stood too neat, too orderly, as if mocking the chaos that used to mean life. Upstairs, I stopped outside Michael's old room. I hadn't gone in last night when I stood at the door. Tonight, I pushed it open. The air was stale, untouched. The walls were still painted the same deep blue, though the posters had long been peeled away, leaving behind faint outlines where tape had held them in place. The bed was neatly made, as though waiting for a guest who never came. I sat on the edge of it. The springs creaked, familiar and foreign at once. This had been his world, his fortress of teenage secrets, his late-night phone calls whispered under covers, his homework scattered across the desk I had built for him. I ran my hand over the wood. The grooves were still there, faint but stubborn where his pencil had pressed too hard during frustrated nights of math problems. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For a moment I almost heard him again. "Dad, can you help me with this one?" And my voice patiently guiding him, even when he groaned. He'd always groan first, then listen. He never knew how much I cherished those moments. Now the room was silent. Silent in a way that seemed to swallow me whole. I returned downstairs. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway, its sound filling the emptiness like a heartbeat. Ellen had given it to me for our 15th anniversary. She said it would keep us on time. I had laughed then, but now it struck me how right she had been. The clock had marked every moment, late-night feedings, Christmas mornings, the anxious waits for Michael to come home from dates. It ticked still, but the people it had measured time for were gone or distant. I stood there listening, as if waiting for the clock to stop to admit it was done. But it didn't. It carried on, indifferent. I poured myself a drink. Not wine, just whiskey, sharp and burning. I sat in Ellen's chair and sipped slowly, staring at the tree. The ornaments shimmered faintly in the dim light. Each one was a story. The ceramic snowman Ellen bought at a craft fair. The popsicle stick star Michael made in first grade, crooked but proud. The angel Ellen insisted on placing at the top every year, even when she was too sick to climb the step stool and I had to do it for her. I thought of Michael's tree across town, bigger, brighter, full of store-bought ornaments that glistened like jewelry. I wondered if he even remembered the ones that hung here. Midnight crept in. I stood and turned off the tree. The glow faded, leaving only the reflection of snow in the windows. The house grew darker, quieter, colder. I whispered into the emptiness, "Merry Christmas, Elle." My voice cracked on the last syllable. For a moment I imagined she answered, not with words but with the way she used to press her hand into mine, grounding me, reminding me I wasn't alone. But my hand was empty and the silence stayed. I went back to the kitchen table. The list I had written earlier lay there still, lines of sacrifice, numbers that told the story of a life given away piece by piece. I traced my finger over the ink. Tuition, $48,000. Wedding, $32,000. Mortgage payments, too many to count. Utilities, groceries, endless little helps. Each line felt like a nail hammered into wood. Not a coffin, no, not yet. But something final, something undeniable. I sat back, the whiskey warming my chest, the cold pressing against the windows. And in that moment, the emptiness of the house seemed to speak louder than the laughter in Michael's. A man can endure loneliness, but loneliness on Christmas, that is different. It isn't just silence. It's rejection given a date stamped in red and green. I thought again of the words, "We weren't expecting you, Dad." They rolled through me not as sound now, but as truth. I wasn't expected, not just tonight, not tomorrow, not in his plans for the future. And yet, without me, without what I had given, there would have been no house for his family, no degree for his job, no perfect wedding for his wife to remember. The irony cut sharper than any knife. I sat in the chair until the bottle was lighter and the list of sacrifices blurred. At some point my eyes closed, though sleep never truly came. The house hummed its hollow tune around me, the clock ticking on, snow falling silent outside. By dawn, one truth had anchored itself in my chest, heavier than the emptiness, stronger than the loneliness. If they could forget me so easily, maybe it was time to remind them. Not with words. Words had already failed, but with something louder, something undeniable. And as the sun began to rise, pale and cold, spilling across the quiet rooms of my empty house, I knew the man they had called a burden was about to become something else entirely. The morning after Christmas broke cold and brittle, the kind of cold that seeps through the glass, past the curtains, and settles in your bones no matter how high you turn the heat. I sat at the kitchen table, still in yesterday's shirt, staring at the list I had written. The ink had dried into the paper, permanent now, as if every dollar and every sacrifice had been carved into stone. I read the words again. Tuition, $48,000. Wedding, $32,000. Mortgage, countless payments. Each line was proof of where my life had gone, proof of what my hands, my body, my time had been poured into. And yet the man who benefited most from those lines had told me without hesitation, "We weren't expecting you." Something inside me cracked, not with noise, not with fury, but with a silence so sharp it cut cleaner than any shout. I rose from the table, carrying the list in one hand. The house creaked as I moved, old wood complaining under my steps as though it too had grown weary of being ignored. I stood in front of the mantel. Ellen's photograph watched me, her smile gentle but knowing. She had warned me years ago, "Don't give him so much that he forgets to be grateful." I thought I had been wiser than that, Thought I could protect Michael from struggle the way a roof protects a home from rain. But roofs, when too strong, make you forget the storm outside, and children raised under them can mistake safety for entitlement. I pressed my hand against the cool glass of her frame. "Ellen," I whispered, "he's forgotten. He's forgotten all of it, and maybe that's my fault." The words caught in my throat. For the first time in years I let the tears fall, not loudly, not messily, just steady like snow melting from a roof drop by drop. I walked to the window, outside. The world sparkled, clean and white. Across the street my neighbor Mrs. Patterson shoveled her walkway, bundled in a scarf too large for her small frame. She waved when she saw me at the window. I lifted my hand, but it felt heavy, sluggish. She turned back to her work. I thought of Michael's house across town, warm, full, laughter spilling across every room. He wasn't thinking of me, not this morning, not any morning. To him, I was a chore to be scheduled, a FaceTime call slotted between presents and dessert. I thought of his words again. "We weren't expecting you." That was the breaking point, not just because I had been excluded, but because I realized something deeper. I had raised a man who believed his father's sacrifices could be erased as easily as forgetting to send an invitation. I turned back to the kitchen table. The list still lay there, accusing and undeniable. Next to it, a folder of old bank documents, records of the mortgage, co-signed papers, the proof that the house Michael lived in, the house he flaunted, was tethered to me. I flipped through the pages. My name appeared again and again, in ink that had bound me to his future more tightly than he ever knew. That was when another truth struck me, sharp and clear. If I had built his life with my hands, then I could also unbuild it. Not out of malice, not even out of revenge, but because sometimes the only way to teach someone the value of a gift is to take it away. I sat down and poured myself another cup of bitter coffee. The steam curled into the air, carrying the faint smell of burnt grounds. I didn't sweeten it. I didn't need to. Bitterness, I thought, was honest. I folded the list carefully, slid it into the folder with the bank papers, and closed it with finality. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with something fiercer, resolve. For decades I had been the man who gave, who bent, who endured. I had been the silent benefactor, the hidden safety net. And where had it left me? Alone, uninvited, erased from the very table I had built. No more. The clock in the hallway chimed 9. Its echo filled the house. I stood, grabbed my coat, and slipped the folder under my arm. The air outside hit me sharp, biting at my cheeks. My breath clouded in front of me as I walked down the driveway. Each crunch of snow beneath my boots felt like punctuation. Enough, enough, enough. I drove into town, the folder resting on the passenger seat. The streets were quiet, most shops still shuttered for the holiday. But the bank's stone building stood solid against the snow, its glass doors locked but its presence undeniable. Tomorrow it would open, and tomorrow I would step inside. For now I simply parked across the street and sat there, staring at the building. My reflection looked back at me in the windshield, lined, weary, but steadier than it had been in years. "You thought I was a burden," I whispered to the empty car. "But you've forgotten who I am. You've forgotten what I built. And now it's time to remind you." When I returned home, the house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a forge. The silence wasn't emptiness anymore, it was space. Space to think, space to plan, space to act. I sat again in Ellen's chair, the folder on my lap, and looked up at her photograph. "You always said I was too generous," I murmured. "Well, love, maybe generosity has its limits. Maybe it's time to stop carrying everyone else's weight. Maybe it's time I carried only my own." Her smile, frozen in time, seemed to hold approval. Or maybe that was only my imagination, desperate for her blessing. Either way, I felt it. That night I slept, truly slept. Not the restless half-dreams of loneliness, but the heavy, steady sleep of a man who has made a decision. And when I woke, I no longer felt like a forgotten father. I felt like a man with a plan. The next morning dawned clear and sharp, the snow outside glittering like a sheet of glass. I woke earlier than usual, my body stiff but my mind alert. The resolve I'd found the night before still burned steady in my chest, and for the first time in years I rose with a sense of purpose. I brewed coffee, black and unadorned, and carried the steaming mug to my small office at the back of the house. It had once been a space for drafting blueprints, for reviewing contracts back when construction sites were my second home. Now it was little more than a storage room, cluttered with old receipts, yellowed papers, and binders stacked like bricks against the walls. I set the mug down, sat at the desk, and pulled the folder closer. The list of sacrifices lay on top, the numbers underlined in heavy black ink. Beneath it were the documents I had kept for years: house deeds, mortgage agreements, co-signed loans. Ellen had always told me to save everything. "You never know when you'll need proof," she'd say. She was right, as she usually was. I flipped through the first stack: university tuition receipts. I traced the faded numbers with my finger, remembering the nights I had come home bone-tired, dust still clinging to my hair, only to sit at this same desk writing checks, paid in full, every one of them. Then the wedding invoices, floral arrangements, catering, the rental hall. Ellen's neat handwriting in the margins, calculating what we could cut. We hadn't cut enough. I had worked weekends, bent my back to cover the rest, paid in full. But it was the third stack, the mortgage papers, that made me pause. I spread them out across the desk, one by one. There was the original deed from the bank, my name written in bold at the top. There were the co-signer agreements, where Michael's name appeared beneath mine, smaller, secondary. There were statements showing payments made, some from his account, but many more from mine, especially in those lean years when his job had faltered and his pride had kept him from admitting it. I leaned back, the paper crackling beneath my hands. This was the truth. The house Michael and his family lived in, the house where laughter rang and stockings hung, the house where I was no longer expected, was mine as much as his. Legally, financially, fundamentally. Without me, it would have never stood. Without my signature, without my payments, the bank would have reclaimed it long ago. Michael hadn't just forgotten my sacrifices. He was living inside them. I picked up the deed, holding it carefully as if it were something fragile. Ellen's name had been there once beside mine before her passing had transferred everything to me. Now it was just my name, black and absolute. My hands trembled, not from age, but from the realization that all this time, while my son had dismissed me as a burden, I had held the keys to his comfort. I could almost hear Ellen's voice in the room. "Roy, don't let them take advantage of you." I hadn't listened then, but I was listening now. I sipped the coffee, now cooling on the desk, and began stacking the papers neatly. My training as an engineer had always taught me to work systematically. Emotions might spark decisions, but it was details that built foundations. Deed, mortgage, payment history, co-signer agreements, all lined up, all irrefutable. If Michael ever thought to challenge me, he couldn't. The law was on my side. Every document proved it. I felt a strange calm settle over me. For so long I had believed myself powerless, dependent on their kindness, at the mercy of their invitations. But here, in black and white, was proof that the opposite was true. They depended on me. Their comfort, their stability, their very roof rested on what I had given. And if I chose, I could take it away. I stood and walked back to the living room. The tree still glowed softly in the corner, its light stubborn against the morning sun. I looked at it differently now, not as a symbol of loneliness, but as a reminder of what I had provided. I had built Christmases, built futures, built homes, and now I would build something else, a reckoning. Later that afternoon, I returned to the office with a fresh legal pad. I began writing again, not a list of sacrifices this time, but a plan. Review mortgage terms with attorney, verify legal rights as primary co-signer, confirm authority to halt payments, prepare documents to withdraw. Each item was a step, each step a stone on the path toward justice. I didn't rush. I wrote carefully, methodically, like laying out a blueprint. This wasn't just an act of spite. It was a construction project of its own kind, only this time, instead of building walls, I was tearing them down. As the evening fell, I found myself standing at the window again. Snow drifted down, coating the street in silence. Across the way, Mrs. Patterson's lights twinkled faintly in her windows. Families everywhere were finishing their Christmas dinners, wrapping themselves in warmth. Michael hadn't called again. He didn't need to. He thought his father was tucked away quietly, waiting for scraps of attention. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I placed Ellen's photograph on the desk beside the papers. Her eyes, kind but sharp, seemed to follow the lines of text to see what I was building. "Don't worry," I told her softly. "They'll learn, they'll remember, and this time they won't be able to forget." The clock struck midnight. I gathered the documents into the folder and set it neatly by the door, ready for the morning. My decision was no longer just a thought or a threat. It was written, proven, and ready to act. I turned off the lights, letting the tree cast its gentle glow one last time. Then I whispered into the quiet, to the house that had carried my sacrifices, to the wife who had warned me, to the son who had forgotten me. "The truth is mine now, and soon it will be yours too." The folder sat by the front door all night, a quiet sentinel waiting for morning. When dawn came, I rose without hesitation. There was no wavering now, no second guessing. The decision had been made, and decisions, once hardened, are easier to carry than doubt. I dressed in my best suit, the charcoal one Ellen had chosen for me years ago. She said it made me look dignified, even when I was bone-tired from long days at the site. I smoothed the lapels, straightened the tie, and for a moment I saw a younger version of myself in the mirror. Not a burden, not an afterthought, a man. The folder felt heavy in my hand as I carried it to the truck. Papers shouldn't weigh that much, but these weren't just papers. They were decades of labor, sacrifice, and trust made visible. They were the bones of the life I had built. The drive into town was quiet. Snow clung to the edges of the road, and the trees stood bare against a pale sky. Denver in winter has a way of looking both beautiful and unforgiving, and that morning it felt like both were meant for me. I parked outside a modest brick building with a brass plaque by the door. Fisher and Associates Real Estate and Family Law. Ellen and I had met Todd Fisher once years ago, when her diagnosis forced us to consider wills and end-of-life plans. She had liked him, said he looked like a man who knew sorrow but hadn't let it turn him bitter. I carried the folder inside. The receptionist greeted me warmly, took my name, and after a short wait led me into Todd's office. Todd stood as I entered, hand extended. He was older than I remembered, but then again so was I. His temples had gone gray, but his eyes were still steady, patient. "Mr. Hayes," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "It's good to see you again, though I suspect this isn't a social call." I managed a small smile. "No, not social. Something more complicated." "Sit down," he said, gesturing toward the leather chair across from his desk. "Tell me what's on your mind." I placed the folder between us. The papers slid across the polished wood like evidence in a courtroom. "My son," I began, my voice quieter than I expected, "seems to have forgotten who's kept the roof over his head all these years." I told him everything, not in anger, not in self-pity, but in the plain, measured way a man speaks when the story has worn grooves into him. The late-night call, the words, "We weren't expecting you," the years of sacrifices, the tuition, the wedding, the mortgage payments made silently. And finally, the truth I had uncovered in the documents, that legally, financially, the house was mine as much as his. Todd listened without interruption, his pen scratching notes, his face unreadable but not unkind. When I finished, the silence stretched for a moment before he leaned back in his chair. "Unfortunately, Mr. Hayes," he said slowly, "your story is not as rare as you might think. Children once grown sometimes believe they are entitled to what was given freely. They forget the cost, but what they believe and what the law recognizes are not always the same." He opened the folder, flipping through the pages carefully. His eyes scanned the deed, the co-signer agreements, the payment records. He tapped his pen lightly against the paper. "Your name," he said, "is primary on all of these documents. You didn't just help. You are the foundation of this house, legally and financially. Without your consent, nothing can happen. They cannot sell it, they cannot refinance it, they cannot even make changes without your signature." He looked up, meeting my eyes. "You hold the reins, Mr. Hayes, whether your son realizes it or not." Relief and sorrow washed over me at once. Relief because I hadn't been imagining my place in all this. I truly did have power. Sorrow, because it had come to this, sitting in a lawyer's office asking for proof that my sacrifices mattered. "What if I stopped making payments?" I asked. Todd nodded slowly. "Then the responsibility would fall entirely on your son, and given the records here, it looks like he wouldn't be able to cover them on his own. The bank would eventually foreclose." The word landed heavy. Foreclose. It meant endings. It meant no more roof, no more fireplace, no more perfect Christmas mornings. "Do I have the right to do that?" I pressed. "Absolutely," Todd said firmly. "It's your choice, your property, your money. The law is on your side." I leaned back, the leather creaking beneath me. For a long time I didn't speak. I thought of Michael, his children, his wife. I pictured their faces on Christmas morning, unaware of the foundation beneath them, oblivious to the cracks already forming. I thought of Ellen. Would she see this as justice or cruelty? Todd seemed to sense the weight of my silence. "Mr. Hayes," he said gently, "you've carried your son's life on your back for years. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for those who take you for granted is to let them feel the ground beneath their feet. Otherwise, they never learn to stand." His words struck deep. I nodded slowly. We spent another hour going over details. Todd explained the process, the timelines, the possible outcomes. He outlined my rights, my options, the steps required if I wanted to act. By the time I rose to leave, my folder was heavier not with papers, but with certainty. At the door, Todd shook my hand again. "Whatever you decide, remember this, you are not powerless. You never were. Don't let anyone, family or otherwise, convince you otherwise." I walked out into the cold afternoon, the sky wide and pale above me. For the first time in years, I felt taller, as if the weight I'd carried had shifted, finally, back into my own hands. When I pulled into my driveway, the house greeted me with its familiar silence, but it no longer felt empty. It felt waiting. I carried the folder inside, set it on the table, and stared at it for a long time. Michael had thought me weak, a burden, someone to be shuffled aside while he enjoyed the fruits of my labor. But tomorrow, or next week, or whenever I chose, the truth inside that folder would remind him of everything. And when it did, Christmas would never look the same again. The house was quiet when I returned from Todd Fisher's office, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until even your own heartbeat feels too loud. I hung my coat by the door, placed the folder carefully on the kitchen table, and stood there for a long while, staring at it as if it might open itself and whisper what I already knew. The truth was simple now. The law was on my side. Todd had confirmed it. I wasn't powerless. The house my son lived in stood on foundations I had laid, not just with my hands, but with my money, my credit, my sacrifices. Without me, those walls would crumble. And yet, the truth was never simple when it came to family. I sat at the table, poured myself a drink, just one finger of whiskey this time, and leaned back in the chair. Ellen's photograph watched me from the mantel, her smile steady, her eyes carrying both comfort and warning. "What would you have me do, Elle?" I asked aloud, my voice rough. If she were here, she might have told me to forgive, to let it go. She always believed in patience, in the slow power of love to wear down even the hardest stone. But she also knew me better than anyone. She knew that love, when bruised too often, could harden into something else. I thought of Michael's words again. "We weren't expecting you, Dad." I let them echo, not to punish myself, but to remember how they had felt. Not anger, not even disappointment, just absence, as if I had already been erased from the picture of his life. And that, I realized, was the part I couldn't forgive. I stood and began to walk through the rooms one by one. In the living room, the Christmas tree blinked softly, ornaments reflecting faint light. I touched the popsicle stick star, crooked from the year Michael made it in grade school. He had been so proud when he brought it home, insisting it hang front and center. That night, Ellen had kissed his forehead, whispering, "Look what our boy made." In the hallway, the grandfather clock ticked, a steady metronome of time that had carried us from one stage of life to the next. It had marked every birthday, every Christmas, every late-night worry. It marked this moment too, as if reminding me that even decisions like this become part of the rhythm of a man's life. Upstairs, Michael's old room waited in silence. I sat on his bed, stared at the faint outlines on the walls where his posters once hung. I remembered the sound of his laughter here, the late-night arguments about curfews, the quiet talks about dreams and futures. I pressed my hands against the mattress, firm but empty beneath me. "I gave you everything," I whispered, and still it wasn't enough. Back in my room, Ellen's side of the bed remained untouched, her glasses folded neatly, her bookmark still stuck in page 247 of a novel she'd never finish. I sat at the edge, staring at that book. Ellen had always warned me not to give too much, not to erase myself for the sake of our son's comfort. I hadn't listened, and now maybe this was the cost of that mistake. I lay back on my side of the bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind drifted through the years, through the sacrifices, through the moments of pride, through the silences that had slowly replaced conversations. For hours I wrestled with myself. Would cutting off the payments destroy Michael? Yes. Would it hurt his children? Yes. Was it cruel? Perhaps. But hadn't he been cruel already? Hadn't he, in his comfort and his pride, already placed me in a corner, stripped of dignity, treated as though I were no longer part of the family I had built? If I let this go, what lesson would remain? That a father is infinite, that he can be used until he is empty and still expected to smile in gratitude. No, I could not allow that to be my legacy. By midnight, I rose again. I poured another glass of whiskey, stronger this time, and sat at the table with the folder. I opened it carefully, spread the papers out before me like a map. The deed, the mortgage, the payment history, the proof. I placed my hand on top of the document, steady now, no longer trembling. "This is mine," I said softly into the stillness, "and I decide what happens next." The next morning I woke early. I shaved, dressed, and carried the folder with me to the truck. The sky was pale blue, the air crisp with winter. Snow crunched under my boots as I walked to the driver's side, and for the first time in weeks my step felt firm. At the bank I sat across from a teller, then a manager, and finally a representative from the mortgage department. The conversations were straightforward, professional. Numbers, accounts, signatures. When they asked me if I wanted to proceed with halting the payments, my voice did not waver. "Yes," I said, effective immediately. The pen scratched against the paper as I signed. The sound felt final, like a door closing, like a chain snapping free. The representative smiled politely, sliding the papers back into a neat folder. "Of course, Mr. Hayes, it's your right." I nodded, stood, and shook his hand. "Thank you." Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not joyful, no, not that, but steady, whole, as if a part of me long buried had risen again. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at the house. The roof glistened with snow, the windows glowing faintly in the winter light. It was still the same house it had always been, but I was not the same man who had walked out of it that morning. I stepped inside, set the folder back on the table, and stood before Ellen's photograph. "It's done," I whispered. Her eyes, frozen in that eternal smile, seemed to hold both sorrow and pride. Maybe I only imagined it, but it was enough. That night, I sat in the quiet, the clock ticking steadily in the hallway, the tree blinking softly in the corner. For the first time in years, I did not feel like a man waiting to be invited. I felt like a man who had finally remembered himself. And though Michael did not know it yet, the life he had taken for granted was about to change forever. The night was still when I finally reached for the stationery box tucked in the back of the desk drawer. Ellen had bought it years ago at a craft fair, cream-colored paper, edges embossed with faint gold vines. She said real words deserved real paper. I had laughed at her then, told her pens and paper were going out of style. She only smiled, placed the box on the shelf, and said, "One day you'll need it." That day had come. I carried the box to the kitchen table, cleared away the mortgage papers, and set the blank sheet in front of me. The lamplight glowed soft against the page, waiting. I uncapped my pen, and for a long moment I simply sat there, staring at the empty space. Then slowly the words began to flow. "My dearest Ellen, It feels strange writing to you like this. For years, I talked to you in whispers, at night when the bed felt too big, in the morning when your chair sat empty at the table. But tonight, whispers aren't enough. Tonight, I need to see the words, to write them down as if proof on paper will make you hear me clearer. Christmas has passed, or perhaps it passed me by. Michael had his holiday, his tree, his laughter, his family. I was not part of it. He told me I wasn't expected. Imagine that, Elle. After everything, I wasn't expected. Do you remember the way his eyes used to light up on Christmas morning? How he'd tear through the wrapping paper like the world was nothing but gifts waiting to be opened? You and I worked ourselves thin to give him that. I remember the year we bought him that bicycle, the storm outside, the worry about money, the way you rubbed my shoulders as I counted crumpled bills at this very table. I thought then, it's worth it. Every ache, every dollar, every sleepless night, it's worth it because he'll remember. But he didn't. Ellen, I went to see Todd Fisher. You'd be proud of me. I finally listened to your advice and kept every scrap of paper, every receipt, every record. Todd laid it out plain. The house Michael lives in, the life he enjoys, it rests on me. On us. My name on the deed, my money in the payments. Without me, that roof would have never stayed over his head. And yet he treats me like a guest, a burden, a shadow to be managed instead of a father to be honored. I don't say this to be cruel. God knows I still love him, but love isn't blind anymore. Love sees clearly and it hurts. Tonight I made a decision. I stopped the payments. The house will fall back into his hands now, into the hands of the man who told me I wasn't expected. He will learn what it means to carry weight, to shoulder responsibility, to feel the ground shift when you have no one holding you up. Is that vengeance? Maybe. Is it justice? I think so. More than anything, it is a reminder. He must remember. You warned me all those years ago. Don't give him so much he forgets to be grateful. Ellen, I gave too much. I gave until he forgot. And now I can't undo the past, but I can teach him that forgetting comes with a cost. Do you know what I fear most? Not his anger, not even his hatred. I fear his indifference, that even when the bank comes knocking, even when the roof trembles, he'll still see me as nothing more than a problem that finally solved itself. But I can't control that. All I can control is myself. For the first time in years, I feel steady. I feel like the man you married, the man who built our home board by board, who promised you we'd have more than we started with, who looked at you across the kitchen table and swore you'd never want for love or safety. I kept that promise to you. I failed to keep it for myself. Until now. The house is quiet as I write this. The clock ticks in the hallway, stubborn as ever. The tree glows faintly, though it feels like it's shining for no one. Your photograph watches me from the mantel, and I like to think you're reading these words as I write them. Ellen, I don't know where this path leads. Maybe to sorrow, maybe to regret, but I know this much: it won't lead to me being erased. Not anymore. If Michael wants to forget his father, let him. But he will not forget the cost. And if he one day finds his way back to me, if he remembers not just what I gave, but who I was, I will still be here. Not as a burden, not as an afterthought, but as the man who raised him. Always yours, Roy. I set the pen down, the ink still glistening on the page. My hand trembled, but not from weakness, from release. Writing it out felt like building a bridge across the silence that had stretched between Ellen and me since she left. I folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and placed it in the drawer beneath her photograph. Not for Michael, not for anyone else. For her, for me. The house was still quiet, but the silence no longer felt suffocating. It felt full, full of memory, full of decision, full of the path I had chosen. I poured myself one last drink, raised the glass toward the photograph, and whispered, "For you, Elle, always for you." The whiskey burned down my throat, sharp and steady. The decision burned brighter still. And in that moment, as the clock ticked toward midnight, I knew. The next chapter of my life had already begun. The days after Christmas slipped by with a strange stillness, like the pause between a lightning flash and the thunder that follows. My house stood quiet, the tree lights blinking softly in the evenings, the clock in the hallway marking time with its patient tick. On the surface, nothing had changed, But inside me, everything had shifted. The letter to Ellen remained tucked safely in the drawer, and the folder of documents sat ready on the kitchen table. Each morning I would open it, flip through the pages again, and feel the same steady calm settle into my chest. My decision was real. It was already in motion. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man waiting to be invited. I felt like a man waiting to be discovered. I spent my mornings tidying the house, more out of habit than necessity. Ellen had always said a home reflects its keeper, and though she was gone, I kept her words alive. I polished the wood floors until they gleamed, dusted the mantel, straightened the photographs. Each task carried memory, but memory no longer cut as sharply as it had. Instead, it felt like armor, layers of proof that I had built this life with my hands, and that no one could erase me without my consent. Afternoons I reserved for preparation. I made lists, checked accounts, reviewed Todd Fisher's notes. I called the bank once, just to confirm the change had been processed. The representative's voice was polite, detached. "Yes, Mr. Hayes, your instructions are in effect. The next payment has been canceled." Just like that, the gears had begun to turn. In the evenings, I sat by the window watching the snow fall in lazy spirals. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson lit her candles each night, their glow soft against the frosted glass. I wondered if she noticed how often I stood there, quiet, watchful. Maybe she thought I was lonely. Maybe she was right, but loneliness was no longer weakness. It was focus. It gave me space to think, to plan, to imagine what would unfold when Michael finally realized the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he believed. I imagined his house, too. I could see it clearly in my mind, Christmas decorations still clinging to the walls, laughter echoing through the rooms, his children playing with new toys, their stockings now empty but their hearts still full, Lauren bustling around the kitchen, already planning New Year's gatherings, and Michael himself, relaxed, confident, smiling as if the world were his to command. Perhaps he poured another glass of wine in the evenings, leaned back in his chair, and thought about the future without once imagining it could shift. He didn't know the storm was already forming. He didn't know that every laugh, every toast, every carefree breath was borrowed, resting on foundations he had forgotten. One night I sat at the desk and wrote again, not a letter this time, but a timeline. Week 1, bank halts payments. Week 2, notices begin. Week 4, formal warning delivered. Week 6, foreclosure proceedings initiated. I underlined the final line twice. Foreclosure. It sounded brutal, cold, merciless. But perhaps mercy given too freely becomes poison. Perhaps my silence over the years had been the slowest poison of all. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not Mrs. Patterson, not an old friend from church, not even the few relatives who still called me around the holidays. This was mine, my decision, my reckoning. At night when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I sometimes heard Ellen's voice again. Not scolding, not pleading, just steady. "You're stronger than you think, Roy, don't forget it." I didn't forget, not anymore. The first week passed uneventfully. No phone calls yet, no signs from Michael's side of town. I knew it would take time. Banks moved slowly but steadily. The storm was not sudden, it was deliberate, creeping closer day by day. On the 7th night I sat by the tree, sipping tea instead of whiskey this time. The house was warm, the lights gentle. For a moment I let myself imagine Ellen sitting across from me, her book open, her glasses sliding down her nose. "You've done enough," I whispered to the memory of her. "Now it's time for him to stand on his own or fall." The clock chimed 10. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing everything in deceptive peace. In Michael's house, I imagined the laughter was still strong. He probably kissed his children good night, tucked them in under soft blankets. He probably told Lauren about new plans for the year, vacations, upgrades, investments. He probably felt secure, safe, untouchable. But storms don't ask for permission. They arrive whether you're ready or not. And mine was already on its way. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. I knew the timing because Todd had explained it. The bank moves slow but steady. Within 2 weeks they'll send the first notice. And right on schedule the gears turned. I wasn't there when Michael opened it, of course. but I could imagine the scene with the precision of a man who had lived too many years reading his son's face. The envelope sat among the usual stack of mail, holiday cards from neighbors, catalogs filled with sales, a bill or two. Lauren probably tossed it onto the kitchen counter without a thought, too busy corralling the kids and planning dinner. It was Michael who noticed the return address: First Colorado Bank and Trust, Mortgage Division. His hand must have paused mid-motion, his brow furrowing in the same way it had when he was a boy puzzled by a math problem. He slit the envelope open, scanned the words, and for the first time in years, felt the quiet pinch of fear. Notice of delinquency. The words were cold, official, impossible to misinterpret. Payment missed. Action required. Immediate attention needed. I pictured him standing there in his spotless kitchen, the granite countertops gleaming, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Lauren would have turned, eyebrows raised. "What is it?" He wouldn't answer at first. He'd read the letter twice, 3 times, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less damning. But they never do. Finally, he would clear his throat. "It's from the bank." Her voice sharp, almost a laugh. "Already, that has to be a mistake." But mistakes don't come on official letterhead. Across town, I sat at my own table sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm, the folder of documents open before me. The air in my house was still heavy with anticipation. I didn't need to see his reaction. I could feel it. The first crack had appeared. That evening, I imagined the conversation unfolding in Michael's living room. The children tucked away in their rooms, the glow of the Christmas tree fading as the days slipped into the new year. Lauren pacing, her voice tight. "What do they mean, Miss Payment? We haven't missed anything." Michael rubbing his forehead, letter in hand. "It's complicated. My dad." He'd stop there because how could he explain what he didn't fully understand himself? They would argue in circles, each clinging to denial, each throwing questions into the air like darts that never landed. And beneath it all, the first thread of fear would pull taut. The next morning, I drove past their neighborhood, slow enough to see without being seen. Their house stood tall, still dressed in holiday cheer, wreath on the door, lights strung along the gutters. To anyone else it looked like comfort, but I knew better. I parked a few streets away and sat quietly in the truck, watching the steam of my breath rise and vanish. Somewhere inside that house, my son was realizing that life doesn't balance itself forever. Debts come due. Forgotten sacrifices don't stay buried. Back at home, I laid the notice timeline on the table again. Step 1 completed, the first crack. I thought of Ellen then, imagined her sitting across from me, her hands folded neatly, her expression a mix of sadness and strength. "Are you sure, Roy?" she might have asked. "Yes," I whispered into the empty room. "They need to feel it, otherwise, they'll never see me at all." The weekend came. I imagined Michael trying to brush it off, telling himself it was a clerical error. Maybe he even called the bank, sat on hold while holiday music played through the receiver, his knee bouncing nervously. The representative's voice, polite but firm, would confirm the truth. Payment not received. No mistake. That night he probably drank a little more wine than usual, staring into the fire, trying not to let Lauren see the crack widening in his composure. But cracks, once formed, never stay small. I slept soundly that night for the first time in months. The clock ticked steadily in the hallway, the house humming its quiet song around me. For once, silence was not loneliness. It was peace. When I closed my eyes, I pictured the look on Michael's face as he read the letter, the furrowed brow, the tight jaw, the first shadow of fear. Not because I wanted to see him suffer. No. But because finally, after years of carrying the weight alone, the balance was shifting. And this was only the beginning. The second notice arrived a week later. This one sharper, colder, stamped with bold red letters. Final warning before action. I wasn't there when Lauren pulled it from the mailbox, but I can imagine how her face tightened, how her hand gripped the envelope as if the paper itself might bite. She stormed inside, slammed it down on the kitchen counter, and demanded answers. "Michael!" Her voice must have cut through the house, shrill and cracking. He appeared from the living room, still in his work shirt, tie loosened around his neck. One look at her face and he knew. It came again, she said, jabbing the envelope with her finger. And this time it says final warning. He tore it open, scanned the lines, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. They can't do this so fast, It's been 2 weeks, Lauren snapped. 2 weeks and already they're threatening foreclosure. What on earth is going on? The children heard, of course. Children always do. Their laughter from upstairs faltered into silence, replaced by the creak of floorboards as they listened. Michael dropped into a chair, running both hands through his hair. "It's my dad," he muttered. Lauren stared at him. "What about your dad? The mortgage, he's on the papers. He's been helping cover the payments for years. Without him," his voice faltered. "Without him, it's too much." The words hung heavy in the room. Lauren's eyes widened, disbelief sharp as glass. "You mean to tell me," she said slowly, "that the house we live in, the house we've built our lives around, depends on your father's money?" Michael lifted his head, anger and shame burning in his face. "It was supposed to be temporary, just until I got back on my feet, and then what?" Lauren cut in. "You thought it would just pay itself, that he'd go on bailing you out forever." Their voices rose, clashing against each other like knives. "You don't understand," Michael shouted. "You think he's some saint, but you don't know what it's like growing up with him, always reminding me of what I owed, always hanging his sacrifices over my head." Lauren slammed her hand on the counter. "Don't twist this, Michael. He gave you everything and you let him. You let him keep paying while you played house and pretended it was all yours. And now look at us." The children's footsteps thudded down the stairs, their eyes wide, frightened. "Mom, Dad, what's happening?" Lauren's voice softened instantly. "Nothing, sweetheart, go back upstairs." But children know when nothing means everything. Across town, I sat in my chair by the window sipping tea. The evening sky had gone dark, stars hidden by winter clouds. I didn't need to hear their argument, I could picture every word. For years I had shouldered their silence, their expectation, their dismissal. Now it was their turn to sit in silence, to feel the ground shift beneath them. I closed my eyes and Ellen's voice rose again in my mind. "Don't give him so much that he forgets to be grateful." Too late for that, but not too late for him to remember. That night Michael didn't sleep. He sat by the fire long after Lauren had gone to bed, the warning notice spread out on the coffee table before him. The firelight flickered against the words, each line a reminder of the noose tightening. He thought of calling me, I'm sure. He probably picked up the phone once or twice, thumb hovering over the dial. But pride is a heavy anchor. He had told me I wasn't expected. To call me now would be to admit he was wrong. And Michael had never been good at admitting that. Lauren, too, lay awake upstairs, staring at the ceiling, resentment coiled in her chest. She would never forgive him for not telling her, for letting their life rest on the shoulders of a man he'd dismissed so easily. The crack in their marriage widened with every tick of the clock. Not because of money, money was only the surface. It was trust, and trust, once broken, is harder to rebuild than any house. Meanwhile, in my own home, I slept soundly. The clock ticked its steady rhythm, the tree lights blinked softly, and for once I dreamed not of loss but of strength. The storm had only begun, but already the first walls in Michael's world were shaking. And I, once forgotten, once cast aside, was no longer a burden. I was the weight that reminded him of everything he had chosen to forget. It came on a cold Monday morning, just as the holiday decorations in Michael's neighborhood began to sag under weeks of snow and neglect. The wreath on his door, once bright with holly berries, hung limp now. The string lights that had glowed cheerfully 2 weeks earlier flickered weakly, one bulb after another giving up. And then came the knock. 3 raps against the front door, firm and professional. Not the hurried knock of a neighbor, not the light tap of a friend. This one carried weight, authority. Lauren opened it first. She stood there in her robe, hair pulled back, coffee mug in hand, her eyes still heavy with sleepless nights. The man on the porch wore a dark overcoat, his shoes polished despite the snow. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm and offered a business card before he even spoke. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes. I'm here on behalf of First Colorado Bank and Trust." Her grip tightened on the mug. "Michael," her voice breaking. Michael appeared, tie already loosened though the workday had barely begun. He froze when he saw the man. "Mr. Hayes?" the visitor asked. Michael nodded stiffly. The man's voice was calm, measured. "I'm here regarding your mortgage account. We've reached out by mail. Perhaps you've seen the notices." Lauren's voice cracked. "Of course we've seen them. There must be some mistake." But Michael knew better. His shoulders sagged as he stepped onto the porch, closing the door gently behind him to keep the children from hearing. "There's no mistake," he muttered. The conversation was short, efficient. The man explained the delinquency, the timeline, the consequences if payment was not restored immediately. Words like foreclosure, repossession, bank action fell heavy in the cold air. Michael swallowed hard, his jaw tight. "I can fix this. I just need time." The man shook his head slightly. "Time is limited. If the account isn't brought current within 30 days, the foreclosure process will begin. Consider this your final opportunity." He handed over a folder, neat and heavy, filled with details Michael barely glanced at. "I'll give you space to look this over," the man said, adjusting his coat. "But understand, this isn't personal, it's procedure." Then he walked away, his polished shoes clicking against the icy pavement. Inside, Lauren was waiting. "Well?" she demanded. Michael set the folder on the table, his hands trembling. "We've got 30 days. Her face paled. 30 days until what? Until the bank takes the house. The silence that followed was louder than shouting. "I wasn't there, but I knew. That afternoon, Mrs. Patterson mentioned it casually when I passed her on the street. Saw a fellow from the bank at Michael's place this morning," she said, tucking her scarf tighter. "Didn't look like a friendly visit." I only nodded, hiding the calm that spread through me. Back home, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. I pictured Michael's face, the panic in his eyes, the weight pressing on his shoulders. For years I had carried that weight for him. Now it was his turn. That evening their house was not filled with laughter. The children played quietly upstairs, sensing the tension. Lauren sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the bank folder with trembling hands. Michael stood by the fireplace, staring into flames that gave no comfort. "You should have told me," Lauren said finally, her voice low, almost dangerous. "I didn't think it would come to this," Michael muttered. "You didn't think," she snapped. "You let your father carry us, and now look where we are." Michael turned, anger flashing. "Don't you start. You never questioned the vacations, the dinners out, the new car. You liked the comfort as much as I did." Lauren slammed the folder shut. "At least I wasn't the one lying about where it came from." The fire crackled. The silence returned. Across town, I sat in Ellen's chair, the letter to her still tucked in the drawer beside me. The house hummed its familiar tune, the clock ticking, the wind brushing against the windows. I closed my eyes and whispered into the stillness, "The storm has arrived." And yet in my chest I felt no storm, only calm. For the first time in years I wasn't the one bracing for disaster. I was the one who had set it in motion. The bank had knocked. The warning had been delivered. The cracks in Michael's perfect home were no longer hairline fractures. They were spreading, fast and wide. And though he didn't know it yet, he would soon have to face the truth. The father he had dismissed as a burden was the same man who held the power to take away everything he thought was his. The phone rang late in the evening. For days I had expected it. Ever since the man from the bank walked up Michael's porch, I knew it was only a matter of time before pride bent beneath the weight of desperation. But still, when the sound split the silence of my kitchen, I let it ring twice before I picked it up. "Dad." Just one word, low and tense, but I heard everything in it. Exhaustion, shame, fear. I let the silence linger a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then I answered softly, "Michael." He cleared his throat, the sound of a man trying to gather dignity from scraps. We got a visit from the bank. They're saying the mortgage is delinquent, that his voice cracked just slightly, that they'll take the house." I sipped my tea, the steam curling gently into the air. I imagine that was difficult to hear. "It doesn't make sense," he continued quickly, almost defensively. "There's been some kind of mistake. I mean the payments, they've always been handled." I set my cup down. "Not anymore." The silence on the line stretched taut and dangerous. Finally, his voice returned, thinner now. "What do you mean?" I said evenly, "that I stopped. The bank will be expecting you to handle your own house from now on." His breath caught. I could picture him there, pacing in his living room, running a hand through his hair, just like when he was a boy cornered by a truth he couldn't argue away. "Dad, you can't." His voice cracked again, then rose. "You can't just walk away from this, my family." "Your family," I interrupted, my tone sharp but steady. "Your responsibility." He fell quiet, and for a moment all I heard was the faint murmur of voices in the background. Lauren's sharp, urgent whispers, the children's footsteps on the stairs. When he spoke again, the pride was still there, but weaker now, crumbling under desperation. "Look, I know things have been tense, but this isn't the way to handle it. You can't just pull the rug out from under us. If you start paying again, I'll make it right. We'll work something out." I closed my eyes, listening not just to his words but to the tone beneath them. The same tone he used when he was younger, asking for money to fix a car, to cover rent, to pay bills he couldn't manage, always promising to make it right, promises that dissolved like smoke. "You told me," I said slowly, "that I wasn't expected this Christmas." The line went silent. "You told me after everything I've done that my presence was inconvenient, that I was a burden." His breath hitched. "Dad, I didn't mean." "But you did," I said firmly. And that was the truth I needed to hear, because now, Michael, you will learn what it feels like when the man you thought was unnecessary steps away. His voice rose, panicked now. "You can't do this. You'll ruin us, the kids." "The kids," I repeated softly, almost to myself. My chest tightened at the thought of them. None of this was their fault. They didn't choose entitlement or arrogance or ingratitude. I steadied my voice. "Your children deserve a father who can stand on his own, not one who leans so heavily on someone else that he forgets how to walk." There was movement on the other end. I heard Lauren's voice, sharp as a blade. "Ask him. Don't dance around it, just ask." Michael inhaled sharply, then spoke again, his words forced, brittle. "Dad, please, help us this one last time." The words hung there, trembling, the first honest plea I had ever heard from him as a man. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I felt Ellen's hand in mine, the way she would press it gently whenever decisions weighed too heavy. I thought of her voice, warning me never to give so much that gratitude disappeared. I opened my eyes, my resolve clear. "No, Michael." The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Finally he exhaled, ragged and sharp. "Then you'll regret this," he snapped, the desperation twisting back into anger. "You'll regret what happens to your grandchildren when we lose this house." My voice stayed calm. "No, son, what I regret is that it took losing everything for you to see me at all." And then I ended the call. The phone lay silent in my hand, its screen dark. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, blanketing the world in white. For a long moment I sat there, listening to the steady tick of the clock in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet strength of my own heartbeat. I had heard my son's plea, and I had answered not with cruelty but with truth. The storm was no longer coming. It was here. It happened faster than Michael expected, slower than I had imagined. 30 days. That was all the bank allowed, and when those days passed without a payment, the machine began to move. Letters piled up on Michael's counter, each one heavier than the last. Phone calls came during dinner, during bedtime, during work. The tone shifted from polite reminders to formal warnings, then to legal notifications. And finally, one morning in February, a notice was nailed to the front door, foreclosure initiated. The neighbors saw, they always do. I didn't need to be there, but I was. I drove down Maple Street slowly, the truck rumbling beneath me, my hands steady on the wheel. I saw Lauren on the porch, tearing the paper down with trembling fingers, her eyes darting to the houses across the street, to the curtains twitching as neighbors watched. Michael stood behind her, pale, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of the entire house had finally landed squarely on him. Their children lingered at the window, confusion in their small faces. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the shame. Children always do. I drove past without stopping, my face unreadable. To them, I was just another car on the street. To me, it was the closing of a chapter I had written with my own hand. That evening, my phone rang again. I let it buzz on the counter until it stopped. Then it rang a second time, then a third. I finally answered, my voice calm. "Dad." Michael's voice was hoarse, broken. "It's over. They're taking the house." I didn't speak. "I don't know what to do," he continued, desperation pouring through the line. "The kids, Lauren, everyone's looking at me like I failed. And I did. God help me, I did." His words were ragged, spilling out in a rush, the voice of a boy again, not the man who had dismissed me weeks earlier. "Please," he whispered finally, "tell me what to do." I closed my eyes. Ellen's face rose in my mind, her voice echoing, "Don't give him so much that he forgets to be grateful." He had forgotten, and now perhaps he remembered, but some lessons come too late. "I can't tell you what to do, Michael," I said softly. "This is your weight now, yours to carry, yours to answer for, not mine." The silence on the line was deep, broken only by his sharp breaths. Finally he spoke, bitter and cracked. "You've destroyed us." "No," I replied quietly. "I only stopped saving you. The rest you did yourself." And I hung up. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow dismantling of a life. Moving trucks appeared in their driveway, hauling out furniture piece by piece. The children's bikes leaned abandoned against the garage until strangers carried them away. The curtains were pulled down, the lights inside grew dimmer, until finally the house stood empty. One afternoon I drove by again. A realtor's sign stood tall in the snow, bang-coned property for sale. It was the same house I had once helped build with my sacrifices, the same house Michael had claimed as his own. Now it belonged to no one. Back in my own home, I sat in Ellen's chair, the letter I had written to her resting in my hands. "It's done," I whispered to the photograph on the mantel. "The lesson has been delivered." But the words did not feel triumphant. They felt heavy, carved deep into me. I hadn't wanted this ending. No father does. We dream of being remembered with love, not with bitterness. We dream of handing down comfort, not consequences. But sometimes love without limits becomes blindness, and blindness has its price. A week later, I received a small envelope in the mail. No return address, but I recognized Michael's handwriting instantly, uneven, almost frantic. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Dad, I don't know if I hate you or thank you. Maybe both. Maybe someday I'll understand. But right now, all I feel is lost. No signature, no apology, just those words." I folded the paper, placed it gently inside the same drawer where Ellen's letter lay. They belonged together, her warning, his confusion, my decision. That night I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window. Snow drifted softly against the glass, muffling the world. For the first time in years I felt free, not happy, not victorious, but free. I was no longer waiting for an invitation that never came, no longer holding up a house where I wasn't welcome. I raised the glass toward Ellen's photograph. "To you," I whispered, "to us, to lessons learned even if they come too late." The wine burned steady down my throat. The silence of the house wrapped around me like a blanket. And for the first time since she left, I felt that I had kept a promise, not to Michael, not even to myself, but to her. I had made sure he remembered.